Hi everyone, welcome to Nimisha's classroom. In this video, we will be discussing the first chapter of class 11 biology, that is the living world. So we will be discussing the living world. This will contain few topics of the living world in the next video. So this chapter we shall do it in 2 videos so that the topics will be little more simplified. So we will go into the first unit, that is diversity in the living world. Under that we shall discuss the first chapter, that is the living world. So we shall discuss half portions of the first chapter in this video and the remaining half portions in the next video. So we shall discuss this chapter in 2 videos so that it will be simplified and it will be easy to understand. So the class is based on NEET syllabus as well as the NCERT syllabus. So let's go into our sessions. The first topic is what is living? That means what are the characteristics of a living organisms? So first let us discuss the first characteristic, that is growth. We know that all living organisms, they grow or they increase in their mass, or they increase the cells will increase in number. Now what are the twin characteristics of growth? So we know that every living organisms, they grow. The twin characteristics or the 2 characteristics of growth are, first one is increase in mass and then increase in number. That means there will be an increase in mass of the living organisms. Also, there will be increase in the number of cells. Now, organisms, you can group them into 2 categories, that is multicellular organism and unicellular organisms. So, unicellular organisms are those organisms having only a single cell, whereas multicellular organisms are those organisms with multiple cells or more than 1 cells. The multicellular organisms, they grow by a process known as cell division. So we have generally 2 different types of cell division, that is mitotic cell division, meiotic cell division. So we shall discuss that later. Multicellular organisms, they grow by a process known as cell division. Now, if we observe plants, we see that the cell division occurs throughout their lifespan, whereas in animals, the growth is seen only up to a certain age. Now, the cell division, they also occur to replace the old cells. That means cell division may also occur to replace the dead cells. Now, as we said that all living organisms, they grow. But growth cannot be considered as a defining property of living organism, because we see that the mountains also increase in their mass. That means certain non-living organisms such as mountains, boulders, sand mounds, they also grow. But the kind of growth seen in non-living organisms is the result of accumulation of materials on their surface, whereas in living organisms, the growth occurs within the organism, or we can say that in living organisms, the growth is a property that occurs from inside. Therefore, we cannot say that growth is a defining property of living organisms, because we see that if we consider the characteristics of growth, even in non-living materials such as mountains, boulders, sand mounds, we see that there is increase in mass. That means we cannot say that growth is a defining property of living organisms. The second property is reproduction. Now, reproduction can be categorized into 2, that is sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. In sexual reproduction, there is gamete formation whereas in asexual reproduction, it involves only a single parent. In sexual reproduction, there may be two different parents, whereas in asexual reproduction, there is only a single parent. Now, this fungus reproduce by spore formation. So it is a kind of asexual reproduction. Yeast and hydra, they reproduce by budding, which is also an asexual reproduction. Planaria or flatworms, they reproduce by true regeneration or fragmentation. That means a part of their body will be divided, and that particular fragment will grow into a new organism. So that is fragmentation. Even in certain fungus, filamentous algae, Protonema of Moses, we see the process of fragmentation, or we see reproduction by means of fragmentation. And in unicellular organisms such as bacteria, unicellular algae, amoeba, growth is synonymous to reproduction. That means, as we said, that growth is the increase in number of cells, whereas now if you consider a unicellular organism, it has only single cell. So if there is increase in number of cells, that means if the cell divides into two, each cell develops into two daughter cells. So that is why we can say that in case of unicellular organism, the growth is synonymous to reproduction. If we are to consider reproduction as a defining property of living organisms, we cannot say that reproduction is a defining property of living organisms. And the reason for this is that the mules, sterile worker bees, infertile couples, they do not reproduce, but still they are categorized as living beings. Hence, we cannot say that reproduction is a defining property of living organisms. So growth and reproduction, they cannot be considered as defining properties of living organisms. Of course, they happen only in living organisms, but still they cannot be considered as a defining property of living organism. The third one is metabolism. Now we know that all living organisms are made up of chemicals. So these chemicals, they react with each other in one way or the other to form certain biomolecules. That means they are constantly made or changed into other biomolecules. These conversions are known as chemical reactions or metabolic reactions. So metabolism means it is the sum total of all the chemical reactions occurring in our body. That means the sum of catabolism and anabolism is referred to as metabolism. So metabolism, or the process of metabolism, it occurs only in living organism. We can also carry out metabolic reactions or chemical reactions outside the living organism, in vitro, in test tubes, under certain conditions. But even though we can carry metabolic reactions outside the body or outside a living organisms, still they are living reactions or living chemical reactions, and hence we can say that metabolism is one of the defining property of living organisms. That means the process of metabolism cannot happen in any non-living organism. Metabolism can happen only in living organism. The first two categories that we have seen, growth, we can see that if we consider increase in mass, we see that even in mountains we see an increase in mass due to deposition of materials, and hence we cannot say that growth is a defining property of living organism. And then come to reproduction, we see that certain living organisms do not reproduce. That means mules, sterile worker bees, infertile human couples, they do not reproduce, and hence we cannot say that reproduction is the defining property. The third one is metabolism. Now every organism, irrespective of whether they are unicellular or multicellular, they show the property of metabolism, and hence we can say that metabolism is one of the defining property of all living organisms. So cellular organization of the body is one of the defining feature of life forms. That means, what is cellular organisms? All living organisms are made up of cells, and inside the cells we see various types of metabolic reactions, and that is why we say that cellular organization of the body is a defining feature of all life forms. The fourth one is ability to sense the environment. Consciousness can be considered, or ability to sense the environment can be considered as a defining property of living organisms, because non-living organisms do not have the ability to sense their environment. So living organisms means, or what do you consider that an organism is living, or how do you say that a particular organism is living? Living organisms means they should be self-replicating, evolving, and self-regulating interactive systems capable of responding to their external stimuli. Now, if we consider human beings, we see that patients who have suffered a brain death, they are kept alive with the use of ventilators, with the use of machines. So we cannot say that they are in a living condition or they are in a non-living condition. So hence, the absolute characteristic for consideration of a person to be living is quite complicating in case of human beings. Now, let's move on to the next heading. So we have seen various characteristics of living organism. Among all the characteristics, we find that metabolism and ability to sense the environment can be considered as defining properties of living organisms. Now let's move on to the next topic, that is diversity in the living world. Now we know that our ecosystem, or we see a lot of organisms in and around us. Certain organisms are visible to our naked eye, whereas the other organisms, they are invisible organisms. That means we see microscopic, we know that there are microscopic organisms and also macroscopic organisms around us. So if we go to count the number of organisms, it will be very difficult, because there are many species of plants, many species of animals, insects, microorganisms. There are many species altogether around us. So it is very difficult to count or to specify the organisms in the living world. So that is why we call it as diversity in the living world. That means there are many organisms living together in the in our ecosystem. Now, each different kind of plant or animal, we call it as species. Every kind of plant or every kind of animal, we call it as species. Now, human being is a species. Mango, if you consider it as a species. So number of species known and described, it ranges between 1.7 to 1.8 million. So see, what is the number of species? It's quite a lot, isn't it? Now, the process of standardizing the names of living organisms such that the organism is known by the same name, the process is known as nomenclature. For example, cat. In English, we can say cat. In Hindi, if you can call it as billi. In different languages, the cat is termed differently. So we need a uniform term so that the name of the cat will be non-universally in every place. So that process of standardization of names of the living organism is known as nomenclature. So nomenclature means we are assigning a name to an organism which is universally accepted and which is the same in every parts of the body, every parts of the world. So such a system or such a process is known as nomenclature. Now, the process of nomenclature or the process of naming is possible only when the organism is described correctly and we know that what organism the name is attached to. That process is known as identification. That means identifying an organism with its name and with its feature is known as identification. Now, there are two bodies, ICBN and ICZN, which indicates the codes for giving specific names to the organisms. In case of plants nomenclature, we use it as ICBN, that is the International Code for Botanical Nomenclature. Then we use ICZN, which is the International Code for Zoological Nomenclature. Now, Worldwide, we use binomial system of nomenclature to assign scientific names to each species. So why we call it as binomial nomenclature is because the scientific name consists of two components. The first component is the generic name. The second component is the specific epithet. So since there are two names for a scientific name, we call it as binomial nomenclature, and this binomial nomenclature was first proposed by Carolus Linnaeus. Now let's take the example of mango. The scientific name of mango is Mangifera indica. Here Mangifera indicates the generic name and indica indicates the specific epithet. So this is how we write a scientific name. Now, there are certain universal rules of nomenclature. The first rule says that biological name should be Latin and it should be always written in italics. Okay. That means whatever scientific or biological name that we assign to the species, it should be in Latin. Also, if you are printing the name, it should be printed in italics. Now, if you are going to write it, if you are going to handwrite it, then the name should be underlined separately. Okay, just like this, it should be underlined separately. Also, the first letter of the generic name should be capital. The first letter of the species name should be in small letter. So this first name, this is the generic name, genus name. This is the specific epithet. The genus name should start with a capital letter. The specific epithet should start with a small letter. And if you are going to handwrite it, it should be underlined separately. If you are going to print it, it should be printed in italics. And the name should always be in Latin language. So these are certain rules of nomenclature. Now, we can also put the name of the author at the end of the scientific name. For example, Mangifera indica Linn. This is the scientific name for mango, where Mangifera is the genus name, indica is the specific epithet, Linn is the name of the author who identified this species. So Linn stands for Linnaeus. Now we know that there are many number of species in the living world. So in order to name each of the species, we need to classify them into convenient categories based on easily observable characteristics. So based on these characteristics, we will group the species into convenient categories. These categories, they are known as taxa. So the categories in which you categorize the organism, so that category will be known as taxa. Now, if you are going to classify organisms into plants and animals, so plants is a taxa, animal is a taxa. Again, in plants, you can also classify them into aquatic plants, terrestrial plants. So aquatic plants also indicate taxa. Terrestrial plant also indicates taxa. So there are different levels of taxa. Even in animals, you can classify them into mammals. Then you can classify them into birds. So the mammals also indicate a taxa. Birds also indicate a taxa. So taxa can be in different levels, or the categories we can observe in different levels. Now, what is taxonomy? Taxonomy means classification of organisms into different taxa. That process is known as taxonomy. Now, characterization, identification, classification, and nomenclature, these are all basic terms to taxonomy. Then we are using a term known as systematics. So the term systematics, it is derived from the Latin word known as systema, and systema indicates the systematic arrangement of organisms. So systematics means it is a systematic arrangement of organisms based on certain characteristics. The term systematic is derived from the Latin word systema. Then Carolus Linnaeus, he published his findings on a publication known as Systema Natura. So this systematics, it is based on evolutionary relationship between organisms. So in this video, we have learned basically about the defining characteristic of living organism. Under that, we learned that metabolism and response to external environment are the two defining characteristics of living organisms. Then we learned about diversity in living organisms. Under that, we learned what is nomenclature, what is identification. Then we learned taxa, classification. And then we learned the system of nomenclature, the binomial system of nomenclature. Then the rules for giving scientific or assigning scientific names to the species. Then we learned about the taxonomy, about systematics. Then the publication of Linnaeus, which is known as Systema Naturae. In the next video, we shall discuss the remaining topics of the first unit. So whatever topics discussed in this video, it is strictly based on NCERT syllabus and also based on NEET syllabus. So all the topics discussed here will be very effective for NEET exams. So if you find this video useful, please like, share it to your friends and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching.